Welcome back to our read on contemporary society and the primary institutions of the arts, music, and communications. This is video 6F Part 9, which continues our focus on the communication platforms embedded in the mega media corporations. In this part, we will continue examining the state of our communications, focusing on TV, cable, and media news, both national, mainstream, and local. We will discuss the heavy bias in today's news organizations and provide some insights into the prevalent corruption of the media culture, both on a moral standards level and in ideology. Let's turn now to electronic news, TV and cable, where today we see the most pronounced bias occurring in mainstream news media. Interestingly, according to the Media Research Center, the most popular news destinations in millions of viewers was determined to be as follows. About 65.5% of the public gets their news from local networks. 28.3% get their news from national networks. Add them together and you get a whopping 94% of America gets their news from TV and cable. Pew Research also published findings supporting television and online programming as representing majority destinations for getting the news, indicating 55% and 39%, respectively, of Americans reported getting their news from these sources. In the mainstream TV and cable news networks, there is a majority of major networks decidedly liberal and progressive, and only one cable network you can consider moderate to conservative when examining the content of what they produce and noting the overall ideological sentiments of each. Looking once again at the graphic produced by Cheryl Atkinson, you can see how these major networks spread almost entirely on the liberal side of the ideological position in America, and weighed more heavily to the left, leaving Fox News, for all matter of speaking, alone and isolated on the conservative side. Any objective analysis of this unbalanced representation of ideology should raise serious skepticism about the quality and fairness of our news. In terms of communications reach, if you look at either chart on the screen, local TV, network TV news, and cable TV news all score very high, totaling 94% as noted earlier. Combined, they are all quite formidable players in getting their message to the public, versus newspapers and radio counting in at 28.4% and 14.7% respectively. We can easily conclude TV news viewing has the highest media reach in America. Has anybody noticed this demonstrative leftward tilt of American media and considered the implications to the consequent distortion of our news, with inherently a progressive bias in stories and commentaries? The answer is yes, some of us have. As Bernie Goldberg points out in his book Bias, we get a first-hand account of what it looks like from the inside looking out, and more importantly, what it should mean to us, and why it's of such serious concern to our society and culture. And so have a host of other authors who've taken on the establishment of left bias in our media, delving into the dynamics and implications of what the slant left means to our thinking, our culture, and the institutions within. They've recognized the deep risk it puts us all in, a risk to honest facts getting reported, a risk to misleading commentary, and a serious jeopardy to our freedom of thought and speech in America, in our politics, government, laws, policies, and society at large. We also have a couple of authors who've taken on the left media bias against Christians, calling them out and demonstrating with facts how many liberals hiding in mainstream media seem inclined to take a swift kick at Christians and Catholics in this country, and not report or underreport the scope of Christian bigotry and killings around the globe, in their practicing a bias to these stories by mainly omitting them, yet not directing a similar prejudice and bigotry towards the other major religions. How often did the news keep you informed of the thousands of incidents over the past 2 decades where Christians were attacked, robbed, and killed, oftentimes in cold blood? Men, women, and innocent children, with their churches burned and destroyed. How often did the liberal news press report on the violence and persecution of Christians in the Middle East, Africa, and China? The answer is rarely or never. Or the story was watered down so the left liberals could exercise their political correctness and not offend those responsible, even if their motivations were radical Islam and ideology. Let's take a closer look at how the major media companies fall on the ideological scale. Comcast, the Walt Disney Company, Time Warner, 21st Century Fox, National Amusements, and Sony, based upon how their TV and cable networks and subsidiaries position either in the left, liberal progressive side, or in the right, conservative side of the ideological spectrum. Each of the major news and cable networks is nested in one of the mega media companies, as you can see on the graphic. Together, these are the companies which largely control our communications in America. The liberal bias we've mentioned when it comes to TV and cable is directly and specifically reflected in these major TV and cable networks, as well as some of their sister divisions within their parent mega media companies. There are only two exceptions, 21st Century Fox and Sony, which one could say positions outside of the liberal side of the mainstream news media. The strong liberal bias comes out in two principal types of programs. First, in the late-night talk shows, and second, in the daily news and commentary programs playing across the week and throughout the day. As we previously covered when discussing Hollywood, we've demonstrated the near unlimited liberal bias resonating in several of the mega media companies, as represented by their networks and cable talk shows airing at night. These shows are completely against conservative positions and always attack President Trump and the conservative leaders. They do so with relentless derision in what amounts to a slanderous ridicule of their names, reputations, their intellect, and at times their families. These networks have taken comedy into a dense fog of liberal hate, aspiration, and degradation of the art form. And this isn't a compliment, by the way. The liberal bias is so completely one-sided that their comedy has morphed into a dark politics of smear, deceitfully masked under the guise of supposed humor. In the second area of bias, news reporting and commentary, nearly all of these major networks clearly fall under the cloud of liberal bias, in what and in how they report the news, or serve under opinions of talk shows. PBS is not directly affiliated with any of the mega media companies, yet still falls under the liberal umbrella. Keep in mind, as we've said before, liberal and left is consistently aligned with relative morality. Right and conservative, just the opposite, mostly aligns with absolute morality. We would contend alignment with relative morality yields a strong inclination to redefine truth to one's convenience, which is a nice way of saying to lie, misrepresent, and deceive. As with moral relativity, or better said, a moral relativist, the desired end always justifies the means to get there. Quite the opposite with absolute morality, where alignment has a higher probability of yielding honest, morally centered reasoning with critical, higher principled thinking and analysis, where the means, abiding by foundational values, are important in justifying the end sought. With these operative principles in mind for both left and right, we would expect to see a lower level of moral behavior or integrity in those following the headwinds of relative morality than those following the higher principled absolute morality. And, in fact, that's what we see. Not surprisingly, we find the left liberal-leaning news networks unabashedly slanting their news. Real honesty is displaced with the contortion of the truth. Commitment to integrity is readily compromised for self-gain, heavily biased by their ideological blindness. Picking and choosing what stories they will cover and those they won't, with their decision factors guiding their choices, not fairness or honesty, but instead whether the import of their reporting will support and advance their biased viewpoints. What they want to do is manipulate the public to believe what they want to feed them, rather than what is best for them to hear and learn. And throughout, they're smug and unapologetic in their delivery and defense of their dishonesty. the public deserves the truth and fullness in the news they get, so that they can think through an issue, apply critical thinking, and choose what they think best, without liberal news media denying the public's right to hear the honest truth, unmolested with their petty bias, or producing commentaries, opinion pieces with deliberate liberal slant, omitting any fact which contradicts their liberal views. Liberal media is misforming the American public. It abounds with example after example, spanning over the past decade and more, a glaring indication of moral relativity infecting the leadership in American media. Here's a couple of examples where the liberal mainstream media went too far in abetting a progressive policy at the direct expense of America's national security. And in doing so, the media was prolific with dishonest reporting and other deceitful tactics in pulling off a masquerade of the truth. Example 1. Illegal immigration. We hear a lot about illegal immigration, and most often from the mainstream progressive media, who is frequently found aiding and abetting illegal crime statistics and left-wing narratives to justify illegal migrants, as opposed to informing the nation about the honest facts and the issues we should be dealing with. A second example was the Iran nuclear deal during the Obama administration, where the liberal networks like CNN, NBC, MSNBC, ABC, and CBS all acted as an echo chamber for dishonest characterizations of the deal. As Ben Rhodes, Obama's national security advisor, later tells us how he fed us a line about the deal, and the liberal media dutifully amplified his messaging, and Obama's false and deceitful activities in making the deal, like Iran's right to self-inspect, trading American hostages for tons of cash, and virtually ignoring Iran's blatant state sponsorship of terrorism and the development of regional and intercontinental ballistic technology. It even went further with Obama's crude treatment of Israel and ignoring our most important ally in the Middle East. But perhaps what was most unnerving was the lack of essential media reporting on the weaknesses of the deal, leaving Iran with essentially their nuclear infrastructure in place and fully functional, providing them with the ability to break out with nuclear weapons in months, should they choose to do so. We see further evidence of moral relativity's decay in the leadership of two major networks, witnessing the toppling of their primetime news anchormen for dishonesty and lying to the American public, putting their liberal-minded bias antagonistically against honesty, accurate news reporting. Dan Rather of CBS and Brian Williams of NBC, both following their moral relative instincts, choose to lie and fabricate instead of upholding journalistic standards for integrity. Brian Ross, an ABC News investigative reporter, a veteran newscaster of a few decades, was suspended by ABC for 4 weeks due to faulty reporting about Donald Trump and the Mike Flynn indictment. Ross has a poor record with the facts, often reporting incorrectly on major stories. Due to what appears to be an overzealous bias, he's been scaled back at ABC. In 2017, the cover came off an underlining issue in the left liberal political media. They became engulfed in a sexual harassment crisis. A wave of sexual harassment allegations has been ripping through the White House press corps and broadcast networks, forcing a reckoning on sexism and power dynamics inside newsrooms at the time when the media's credibility is already under attack. Charlie Rose of CBS and PBS fame has been accused of numerous sexual harassment over his career, and subsequently fired from CBS and suspended from PBS. And the rush of similar cases have been pouring in. Glenn Thrush of the New York Times, Charlie Rose of CBS, author Mark Halperin, NBC's Matthew Zimmerman, NPR's Michael Orts, Vox's Lockhart Steele, the New Republic's Hamilton Fish, the Atlantic's Leon Wieseltier, all from liberal, left progressive media, and all willing to compromise their integrity with moral relativist standards for self-gain. NBC is in the news on November 14, 2017, announcing it has fired an executive in the company, Matt Zimmerman, Senior Vice President for Booking in the company's news division. He was dismissed for engaging in inappropriate conduct with more than one woman at NBC Universal, the parent company of NBC. NBC is again in the news on November 29, 2017, announcing it has fired Matt Lauer for sexual misconduct allegations. As the New York Times reported, Lauer was NBC's leading morning news anchor and one of the principal public faces for NBC worldwide. On November 29th, CNN fires a senior producer of its Sunday morning show for alleged sexual misconduct allegations. One Teddy Davis, producer on Jake Tapper's State of the Union show. CNN reported it had fired Davis after a comprehensive investigation. Even on the right side of the political spectrum, we find inconsistency at times. Take Fox News, for example. Not all behavior, despite conservative or centric ideological sentiment, is governed by standards of absolute morality, where Roger Ailes, Bill O'Reilly, and Eric Bolin were all let go for alleged sexual misconduct. We don't know for sure if the charges were true, as they are contested, but Fox senior management felt there was enough credibility to the allegations to act on them. One would think Fox News, being on the right and generally conservative side of the ideological spectrum, would have employees who would consistently subscribe to principles of absolute morality. Apparently, that may not always be the case. Sometimes people have conflict with moral and legal standards. As on many subjects, the individuals may stray in their choices and actions from the base underlying moral philosophy, which either the individual claims to adhere to or the organization to which the individual is a member stands for. On November 24th, the day after Thanksgiving, MSNBC's Morning Joe show was caught trying to fool their viewers into thinking the Friday show was live when it was not. The show was found out to be pre-taped, yet host Joe Scarborough and his co-host Mika Brzezinski discussed their Thanksgiving Day meals, even though the holiday hadn't occurred yet, when they taped the show the Wednesday before Thanksgiving. Caught red-handed, they were exposed in their lie, deliberately attempting to deceive their audience with fake stories, symptomatic of the liberal, morally relative network and a clear example of degradation in the media's integrity. All being said, one might think this wasn't a big deal, but it is. If you're willing to lie about the littler things, how can you be trusted on the bigger things? It goes right to the heart of integrity and the arrogance of media elites like Scarborough and Brzezinski. To them, it's okay to lie and deceive their audience. Apparently, they don't care about authenticity and trust. And you'll see in a moment, there's a wider pattern of weak integrity associated with the Morning Joe show. MSNBC's Morning Joe has had two frequent guests on the show, each who have been fired from their jobs for sexual misconduct. One, Mark Halperin, who was a regular contributor as a political journalist, often appearing as a panelist on Morning Joe. Halperin was fired by NBC for several accusations by women when he had worked at ABC News over a decade ago. Unfortunately, when a show's guests are fired by companies for low integrity, you have to wonder about the integrity of what they prognosticated for months about, in this case on Morning Joe's show. Another frequent commentator on the MSNBC show Morning Joe, Harold Ford Jr., was fired by Morgan Stanley over an allegation of misconduct toward a woman. Harold Ford Jr. likewise was let go for low integrity behavior. Not a good track record for Joe Scarborough, to have two of his frequent commentators accused and fired for sexual misconduct. When you connect the dots, you see low integrity with Joe Scarborough and his sidekick Mika, followed by low integrity with Halperin, and then again low integrity with Harold Ford Jr. A trifecta of relative morality, all clear examples of repulsive behavior and deceit, and we're supposed to trust what they say? Janelle Ross, a reporter for the Washington Post, known for her generally impartial reporting, not only attended but even spoke at a decidedly liberal top-secret meeting. The Washington Free Beacon headlined, "The Washington Post reporter is now facing accusations of bias in reporting," after participating in the California event presented by the group Democracy Alliance, without telling her prestigious employer that she would be working directly with high-profile liberals, outlining the future of the so-called liberal agenda. Among those donors in attendance was the controversial progressive billionaire George Soros. You see how the line of collusion between left media and left politicians is easily crossed. You have to ask yourself, what's really going on over at NBC? When they turned down Ronan Farrow's solid expo on Harvey Weinstein despite sufficient and collaborated material, forcing him to go to the New Yorker with the piece, yet NBC's most senior leadership was seemingly ignorant of many, many months of all the sexual harassment occurring at NBC. It's hard to believe, if not revealing. For our examination, what is relevant is if the media institution itself is complicit in the confliction of morals or respecting the law, either through its indifference or there's a revealing abuse pattern across the organization, over time, of ignoring such standards. Especially at the higher levels of leadership, management associates, and key figures within the organization, regarding what standards or morals they personally follow or don't, regarding the frequency and complexion of standards they don't follow nor enforce. This is exactly the problem the networks and the politicians are now facing in Congress. Both individuals at key positions in the networks and Congress have crossed the line, repeatedly compromising values and institutional standards. And they did so over time, years and decades, in revealed patterns of behavior, and the institutions around those individuals have been largely complicit over those many years, in allowing an indifference in their leadership culture and consistency of holding to standards, and not providing the right leadership to ensure a healthy, respectful organizational climate, consistent with right moral behavior and at times compliance with the law. This concludes 6F Part 9. We encourage you to go on to Video Narrative 6F Part 10, where we will continue examining the state of our communications, focusing on how the media has taken sides in our nation's politics. We will discuss the heavy bias and its consequent impact to our national freedoms.